I was living in a 5x10 storage unit, eating cold beans from a can, when I found the briefcase that changed everything. My name's Roger Hendris, and 6 months ago, I had it all. A beautiful wife, 2 kids, a steady job at the lumber mill. Now, I'm staring at $50,000 in cash and coordinates to somewhere in Montana. The note says this is just travel money. But what I found when I got there made me realize my entire life had been orchestrated by someone I never expected. You want to know how a man goes from having Sunday dinners with his family to sleeping on a cot surrounded by concrete walls? How someone loses their wife to their boss, their kids to lies, their dignity to a world that kicks you harder when you're already down. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, because the ending of this story isn't what you think. My wife Melanie always said I was too trusting. I trusted the people around me, and that trust cost me everything. It started with subtle lies, small betrayals hidden in plain sight. An extra phone call here, a late night there. But by the time I realized the depth of the deception, it was too late. My boss, the man I thought of as a mentor, had taken advantage of every weakness, every blind spot I had, and ripped my life apart piece by piece. I remember the day I came home early, the way my stomach sank when I saw him leaving our house, laughing with her. And the kids, they didn't even look at me. That's when I knew my world as I knew it was gone. But life has a way of giving you a second act, even when the curtain falls the hardest. That briefcase, that cold Montana wind, that $50,000, they were the first sparks of a fire that would turn revenge from a dream into a plan. The life I had before all this felt like a dream now, the kind that lingers in your head, but vanishes the moment you wake. I used to wake up to the sound of Melanie's coffee brewing and the soft chatter of the kids getting ready for school. Our little house wasn't fancy, but it was home. I had a routine, the mill, the grind, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I could provide. And I thought I could trust the people around me, especially my boss, Mark Larson. Mark was charming in a way that made you forget the sharp edge beneath. He'd pat you on the back after a tough day, tell a joke that made everyone laugh, and somehow, even his presence demanded respect. I considered him a friend, maybe even family, and I never suspected the cold manipulation hidden behind that easy smile. It started small. Melanie would mention late nights at the office, odd meetings, things that didn't add up. I shrugged them off. It's work, I told myself. He's probably just stressed. My kids seemed happy enough and I still had my paycheck. But trust, as I was about to learn, can be the deadliest blindfold. Then came the day that changed everything. I got a call from HR, not the usual one about overtime or benefits, but a formal notice. Your position has been terminated. Effective immediately. I didn't even get a chance to fight it. No warning, no reason beyond some vague reference to company restructuring. My hands shook as I hung up the phone. Losing a job is one thing. Losing your livelihood, your identity, your routine, it's another entirely. I went home expecting to be comforted, to find solace in Melanie's arms. But instead, the house was eerily quiet. The laughter of our kids was gone. Melanie met me at the door with a suitcase in hand and a look I barely recognized. She didn't explain, didn't apologize. She just left. With Mark. My children followed, confused, manipulated by words I wasn't allowed to hear. My world, my family, my security, my dignity was ripped from me in a way that left no room for negotiation. I spiraled fast. I tried to cling to anything familiar. Friends, the few co-workers I trusted, the remnants of a normal life. But everything reminded me of what I had lost. I slept in my car, sometimes at friends' couches, until eventually, I ended up in the storage unit. Cold metal walls, the smell of dust and old cardboard, beans from a can. It became my new reality. But it was in that despair, that absolute low, that I stumbled onto the briefcase. It was old, worn, and locked with a simple combination. Inside, the money alone would have changed my life. But it was the note and the coordinates that truly startled me. Whoever left this knew exactly what I had lost, and perhaps what I was capable of. The promise of a second chance, of uncovering something hidden, ignited a fire I didn't know was still alive. I realized then that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about understanding the full scope of betrayal, tracing it back to the source, and planning a response that would make Mark Larson regret ever crossing me. What followed was a journey into a past I didn't fully know, a secret family fortune, and a reckoning that would test the limits of patience, cunning, and vengeance. Montana was nothing like I expected. The landscape stretched wide, cold winds cutting through the trees, and snow clinging stubbornly to the mountains. But I wasn't here for the scenery. I was following a trail left by my uncle, a man I barely knew but whose life now held the key to my revenge. The coordinates led me to a small, seemingly abandoned cabin at the edge of a dense forest. I approached cautiously, heart pounding, aware that every step could be the difference between finding the truth and walking into another trap. Inside, the cabin was silent except for the faint creak of wooden floorboards under my boots. Dust lay thick over everything, but in the corner, a metal safe glimmered faintly under the light from the window. The combination? Hidden in plain sight within a faded journal that belonged to my uncle. As I turned the pages, I uncovered a life of secrets, money, and power. My uncle wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. Millions were stashed in offshore accounts, hidden properties, and investments so obscure that even the most seasoned financial expert would be baffled. But uncovering this wasn't just about money. It was about leverage. Everything I had lost, the kids, Melanie, my dignity, suddenly felt within reach of being righted. I realized that my uncle had left breadcrumbs intentionally, as if he had foreseen the chaos that might befall our family. I began to piece together a plan. First, secure the assets, then use them to regain control over my life, and finally, deliver justice to the man who had stolen everything from me. Every day in Montana was a test. I learned to navigate the financial labyrinth, contacting lawyers, accountants, and discreet brokers while keeping my trail hidden. Meanwhile, news of Mark's increasing arrogance reached me through mutual acquaintances. He had begun flaunting his triumph, unaware that I was no longer the broken man he thought I was. Each boast, each smug message fueled a growing fire inside me. The man who once seemed untouchable was about to discover the cost of underestimating me. I also started to gather evidence of how he had manipulated Melanie, using lies and subtle threats to turn her against me. The more I dug, the more I realized just how calculated everything had been. My life hadn't just been ruined by chance. It had been meticulously engineered by someone who thought they could control every outcome. But they hadn't counted on one thing. Desperation can sharpen the mind, and betrayal can turn a man into something dangerous. Montana gave me more than just the means to fight back. It gave me focus. I trained myself to be patient, to anticipate Mark's moves, and to prepare contingencies for every possible scenario. My uncle's fortune wasn't just money, it was a weapon, and I was learning how to wield it. Every night, staring at the cold Montana stars, I planned my next step. One misstep, one miscalculation, and it would all collapse. But I was ready to risk everything to reclaim what was stolen from me. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and soon, Mark Larson would realize that the man he betrayed wasn't the same man he left behind. I was coming back, not just for revenge, but for total reclamation of my life. The day finally came when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Mark Larson had grown reckless, flaunting his victories as if daring the world to challenge him. But I had been patient. Every call, every lead, every dollar I secured from my uncle's secret fortune was a step closer to leveling the playing field. Montana had sharpened me every betrayal. Every sleepless night had forged a plan that Mark would never see coming. I arrived at the office early, blending into the familiar hum of the building I once called home. The smell of coffee and freshly printed reports hit me like a punch, a stark reminder of how long I'd been absent from this life. I wasn't just back. I was armed with the power and knowledge to turn the tables completely. I had the leverage now, and it was time to remind Mark who he had underestimated. Mark's office door opened, and there he was, smug, arrogant, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. I stepped in calmly, a briefcase in hand, and watched as his confident smile faltered. "Roger?" he asked, pretending surprise, though I could see the subtle twitch in his jaw. He didn't know it yet, but everything he had built on lies and manipulation was about to crumble. I laid the briefcase on his desk, flipping it open to reveal evidence he had thought was hidden. Bank statements, property deeds, secret accounts, all meticulously traced back to his fraudulent activities. The ways he had manipulated Melanie, the ways he had stolen from me and countless others. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages, the first flicker of fear breaking through his arrogance. "You think you can walk over people and get away with it?" I said, voice steady, controlled. "But you forgot one thing. Desperation makes a man dangerous. And I've been desperate." I watched as his face paled, realizing for the first time that power is meaningless when someone knows exactly how to dismantle you. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to beg him to understand. The evidence spoke louder than words. Every smear, every betrayal, every stolen moment of my life was now reflected back at him, in black and white, undeniable. Mark tried to argue, to threaten, but it was too late. Every move I had made, every resource from my uncle's secret had cornered him. The balance of power had shifted entirely. I wasn't just seeking revenge. I was reclaiming my dignity, my life, my identity. And for the first time in months, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt since Melanie left. Control. Walking out of that office, I felt the weight of months of despair lift, replaced by a burning satisfaction. This was only the beginning. There were still battles ahead, and the ultimate prize wasn't just revenge, it was total reclamation. But for now, Mark Larson understood one undeniable truth. Never underestimate the man you've broken. Mark Larson wasn't finished. As much as I had rattled him in his office, his arrogance didn't allow him to stay down for long. The next morning I started receiving veiled threats. Cryptic messages, anonymous calls, even a car parked suspiciously outside my temporary Montana lodging. It was clear he was trying to regain control, to intimidate me, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I had learned too much, gained too much, and I had patience on my side. The twist came when I uncovered an even bigger piece of the puzzle. Hidden in my uncle's journal was a letter I hadn't noticed before, tucked in a fold marked with a peculiar symbol. It wasn't just money my uncle had left behind. It was leverage far beyond anything I had imagined. A network of contacts, old business partners, legal loopholes, and shell corporations all intertwined to create a fortress of financial and legal power. This was no longer just about reclaiming what Mark had taken. This was about ensuring he could never hurt me or anyone else the same way again. With this new revelation, my strategy evolved. I started coordinating carefully, making calculated moves to manipulate events without being traced. I discovered weaknesses in Mark's empire, subtle cracks that his overconfidence had hidden. Small wins began to accumulate. Frozen accounts, canceled contracts, whispered rumors in the right circles. Every action I took was like dropping a domino, each one edging closer to a total collapse of everything he had built on deceit. Meanwhile, Melanie became a silent variable in my plan. I didn't reach out to her directly. She had made her choices, but I watched from a distance, learning how deeply Mark had manipulated her. The realization was bitter. She had been a pawn, blinded by his charm and lies just like everyone else. But that didn't matter as much now. My focus was singular, unwavering. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided. I was a force he could neither predict nor control. Night after night, I pored over documents, mapped out Mark's connections, and anticipated his moves. Every whisper of activity, every unexpected email became a signal to act. And Montana's cold, isolating landscape gave me the space to think, plan, and sharpen my strategy. The man who once stole my life didn't know that I had a weapon far stronger than rage, knowledge. Knowledge of him, his empire, and the hidden power my uncle had left behind. The tension escalated when a close ally I had recruited from my uncle's contacts warned me that Mark was starting to suspect the trail I was following. He had noticed shifts, subtle anomalies in his finances, and was growing desperate. This was the moment I had been waiting for. His desperation would make him reckless, and I could exploit it fully. By the time I stepped back into his orbit again, I wasn't just seeking revenge. I was orchestrating a complete dismantling of the man who thought he was untouchable. The stakes had never been higher, and the game had only just begun. Every move from this point on would test my patience, my cunning, and my ability to wield my uncle's secrets like a weapon, and I was ready. The first strikes I landed didn't look like fireworks. They looked like paperwork, dry, meticulous, legal warfare, but they bit where it hurt. I started small and surgical. A shell corporation dissolved here, a lien quietly placed there, a whisper to a journalist about questionable bidding practices. My uncle's network moved like a shadow army, and I guided it. Lawyers filing the right motions, an offshore trustee quietly seizing assets, a broker freezing a line of credit with a curt email that said nothing but meant everything. Mark's empire began to shiver. One of his largest suppliers received a certified letter that made their lawyers call him the same day. A bank officer who'd once laughed at our branch's concerns suddenly had a stack of flagged transactions and a calendar appointment labeled review. I watched from the outside as his companies stalled, bids lost, contracts delayed, a credit rating that slowly, painfully dipped. He tried to laugh it off in meetings, but the laugh sounded thin. People notice when money becomes uncertain. Loyalty evaporates when the ledgers go red. The more I chipped away, the more he made desperate mistakes. He started firing people who were inconvenient, rewriting contracts with loopholes that betrayed panic. Those moves built a paper trail even my uncle hadn't left. I fed the right records to the right auditors. I let the system do what I couldn't with a fist. The thrill wasn't in the humiliation, although I admit it tasted sweet. It was in watching a man's control unravel after he'd spent years taking control of other people's lives. Melanie's life changed too, in quieter ways. Rumors reached her through mutual friends, then direct evidence she couldn't ignore. Expense reports, hotel receipts, messages Mark thought were deleted. For the first time, her eyes looked at him without that glazed, apologetic loyalty. She called once, not to beg, not to explain, but to ask if I knew anything about the documents that had surfaced. I kept my voice steady, offered nothing she didn't already have, and felt something thaw inside me. This wasn't reconciliation, it was the reclamation of truth. I didn't take anything dramatic from Mark. No late-night confrontations, no public shaming posts. My uncle taught me patience. The law took what the law could, and where it couldn't reach, my network did. I secured a handful of accounts in my name, small at first, managed by trustees who owed loyalty to my uncle's memory. These accounts bought me stability. A modest apartment, a lawyer who finally listened without pity, and the chance to see my kids at supervised visits. It wasn't full victory, but it was proof that the tide had turned. Emotionally, the impact was seismic. The man who'd been hollowed out by loss felt himself filling up again. Not with vengeance's blind heat, but with a slow, sober confidence. I could sleep without the constant dread of homelessness. I could stand in front of my children and talk about baseball, about school, about the little things that stitch a life together. Those moments were small, fragile, and everything. There was collateral damage, of course. Mark's fall hurt more than him. Employees lost paychecks. Contractors were left in limbo. I tried to steer my actions to minimize harm to innocence. But you can't pull at a thread without a few seams loosening. I kept that in my head on long, quiet nights, because revenge tempered with conscience is a different animal than revenge as a disease. By the time the first official inquiry into Mark's finances was announced, I stood in a parking lot and let out the breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It was only the beginning. Pieces of my life were back in motion. The apartment key in my hand, one weekend visit with my kids on the calendar, a lawyer's card in my wallet that said, simply, call when you're ready. I was ready. The plan had teeth now, and the world that shoved me into a storage unit had begun to notice that I had learned to bite back. Mark Larson didn't take long to figure out that things were slipping through his fingers. By the time the legal notices started arriving at his office, he had already begun unraveling in ways I hadn't anticipated. He called board meetings with trembling hands, barking orders that made no sense. He tried to manipulate auditors, threaten lawyers, and bribe accountants. But every move I anticipated, every loophole I had secured from my uncle's network, blocked him. The man who once controlled everything now felt the walls closing in, and I was the one holding the blueprint. I stepped into the next phase carefully. Montana had taught me patience, but I wasn't waiting idly. I began placing subtle traps, contracts with clauses that only I could trigger, financial transactions disguised as routine, all carefully calculated to corner him completely. Every call I made, every legal maneuver, was designed not just to strike, but to make Mark feel the fear I had felt when he stole my life. For weeks, he chased shadows, trying to fix problems he didn't fully understand. Then came the confrontation I had been waiting for. I met him in a neutral location, a quiet, nondescript office building downtown. He entered with the arrogance of a man still clinging to control, but the subtle tremble in his hand betrayed the panic under his suit. "Roger, I don't know what you've done, but you need to stop," he said, voice sharp but unsteady. I smiled, calm, measured. "I'm not here to stop, Mark. I'm here to finish." I laid out the evidence I had meticulously gathered: offshore accounts, manipulated contracts, falsified audits. Every lie he had told, every move he had made against me, was documented. The proof was undeniable, and for the first time, he couldn't buy his way out, manipulate his way out, or charm his way out. His empire, built on deceit, was crumbling, and I had every piece in my hand. He tried to argue, tried to twist the story, but I had anticipated every lie. His panic grew, his arrogance faltered, and his words became frantic. "You don't understand!" he shouted. "You have no idea what you're messing with!" But I did understand, better than he ever could. I understood betrayal, desperation, and the power of knowing exactly how to dismantle a man who thought he was untouchable. By the end of that confrontation, Mark Larson was stripped of his confidence, exposed to everyone who mattered in his professional circle, and completely aware that his control was gone. The man who had taken my wife, my children, my dignity, and my livelihood was finally powerless, and I stood over the remnants of his arrogance without raising my voice. The law, my uncle's fortune, and months of careful planning had done what rage alone could never achieve. Walking out of that building, I felt a surge of vindication. This was more than revenge. It was a reclamation of every part of my life he had tried to destroy. But I knew the story wasn't over yet. Melanie, the kids, and even Mark's remaining influence were still variables in the final chapter. I had won the first battle, but the war for closure and for the full measure of justice was only beginning. Even after Mark Larson's empire started crumbling, the game was far from over. Just when I thought I had gained the upper hand, a new complication emerged. Melanie, cautious and guarded, reached out, not to reconcile fully but to warn me. "Roger, you need to be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "Mark, he's not done yet. He has connections, people who will do things he can't." Her warning sent a chill down my spine. I realized that while I had dismantled his visible world, there were hidden pieces I hadn't yet accounted for. Allies who remained loyal out of fear or greed, legal loopholes that could drag my victory into months of court battles, and perhaps even someone inside my uncle's old network who had their own agenda. Every step I had taken now carried new stakes. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was survival, strategy, and outsmarting a man who had once controlled my life completely. I returned to Montana to regroup. The cabin that had once been my refuge became my war room. I pored over documents again, tracing transactions, uncovering hidden properties, and identifying weak links in Mark's support system. Every lead I followed exposed new layers of deception, but it also revealed opportunities. My uncle's fortune wasn't just money. It was a web of influence I could wield to isolate Mark completely. Over the next weeks, I struck carefully, leaving no trace of my involvement. A key associate of Mark's was subtly undermined by an offshore audit I orchestrated. A business partner, loyal only to the promise of gain, found contracts voided by clauses buried in the fine print. Every move was invisible but effective, slowly severing the lifelines Mark still clung to. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. One of Mark's closest allies tried to turn the tables. Attempting to reach out to Melanie in hopes of negotiating a deal, I intercepted the move before it could spiral out of control. It was a stark reminder that Mark's influence extended beyond him alone, and that to fully reclaim my life, I had to account for every pawn in his game. I also realized that my own focus had been singular, Mark. But the collateral damage, the lives impacted by his arrogance and my revenge, had to be acknowledged. I reached out quietly to some affected employees, ensuring they weren't left stranded by the chaos I was orchestrating. Revenge without conscience is empty, it's just destruction. Strategy with conscience builds something stronger. By the time I returned to the city where Mark still lurked in shadows, I was ready. I had turned his world into a minefield where every step could explode into ruin, and I was in control of every detonator. The stakes had risen, the tension had spiked, and the final moves would require precision, patience, and an unflinching resolve. I wasn't just coming for revenge anymore, I was coming for total reclamation. And this time, no one, not Mark, not his allies, not even fate itself, could stop me from getting what I was owed. The final act was coming, and I had the advantage. The culmination of months of planning, patience, and meticulous execution finally arrived. Every subtle move I had orchestrated began to converge, and the impact on Mark Larson's life was immediate and devastating. Contracts he thought secure were voided, accounts frozen, and allies who once feared him turned against him once they realized his empire was no longer untouchable. I watched from a distance as the first dominoes fell, knowing each one carried the weight of his arrogance and betrayal. Mark's panic became almost tangible. His office, once a symbol of control and intimidation, now felt like a cage. Emails went unanswered, phone calls were ignored, and employees began quietly removing themselves from his orbit. Every move he made to regain control only hastened his downfall. It was poetic justice, the kind you can only appreciate when you felt the full measure of betrayal firsthand. Meanwhile, I used my uncle's network to ensure I wasn't just dismantling Mark's world, but also securing my own. Offshore accounts were properly transferred into my name, legal ownership of assets was validated, and the remnants of my uncle's fortune were carefully managed to create a buffer for the future. I was reclaiming more than revenge. I was rebuilding a life with the stability I had lost. Melanie, cautious yet observant, began to see the truth in ways she hadn't before. She reached out, not to rekindle old flames, but to acknowledge the power of what I had achieved. I didn't realize how deep it went, she admitted quietly. I said nothing, letting the silence speak. Actions, not words, had been my instrument of justice, and in that silence, she understood exactly who had been wronged and who had reclaimed control. The emotional impact on me was profound. I had lived months in despair, betrayal, and isolation, Yet I had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger. My focus, honed by loss, guided every step of this process. The man who had once slept comfortably in his stolen victories now faced the consequences of his choices. It wasn't vengeance in its rawest, most destructive form. It was strategy, patience, and precision. Mark Larson's fall wasn't sudden. It was methodical. Every misstep he made was amplified by my foresight. By the time authorities, auditors, and former associates fully recognized the extent of his failures, he was already isolated. He had no power, no credibility, and no allies willing to stand with him. He had underestimated the man he had tried to destroy, and that miscalculation had cost him everything. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. The storage unit, the beans, the despair, they were behind me. The kids, though distant, had glimpses of stability returning. The briefcase that started it all had led me to more than money. It led me to the truth, the power, and the ability to reclaim my life on my terms. Justice had been served, not with rage alone, but with calculated precision that ensured it was lasting. I walked away from the chaos I had orchestrated, knowing that Mark Larson's empire was gone, his influence dismantled, and my life finally beginning to heal. I had won. Months had passed since Mark Larson's empire collapsed. The world moved on, but I carried the lessons and scars of what had happened. The storage unit, the cold beans, the feeling of being completely powerless, it all seemed like another life now. I had reclaimed my dignity, secured my uncle's fortune, and dismantled the man who had stolen everything from me. But the impact of those months lingered in subtle ways, shaping how I approached every decision, every relationship, every step forward. Melanie and the kids were slowly finding their footing too. Visits became more frequent, conversations warmer. I didn't expect full reconciliation. Trust, once broken, is never fully restored. But I saw hope, glimpses of the life I had lost. More importantly, I had learned to value control over chaos, strategy over anger, and patience over impulsive revenge. Those lessons would guide me long after the immediate consequences of my actions had faded. Mark Larson, meanwhile, was a cautionary tale. Word of his downfall spread quietly but effectively. Former colleagues avoided him, contractors severed ties, and the few allies left were more concerned with protecting themselves than salvaging his reputation. His arrogance had made him blind, and in the end, it was the very thing that ensured his undoing. As for me, I no longer needed to live in fear or despair. The briefcase that had started this journey was more than money. It was a symbol of resilience, strategy, and justice served in the quiet, calculated way that only someone who has been truly betrayed can understand. Life wouldn't return exactly to how it once was, but in a strange way, that was a blessing. I had been broken, yes, but I had rebuilt, and in the process, I discovered that sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't chaos. It's reclaiming your life, piece by piece, until the world finally recognizes the strength you always had.